Hello, my name is Tony Seaton. I'm with the Strategic Management Department here at Fox. And today we're going to be talking about the analytic process, an 8-step framework for effective case analysis. Just a little bit of background before we get to the learning objectives. Oftentimes in business school you're faced with, say, a Harvard business or an Ivy business case, and you're asked to actually deconstruct it and come up with some meaningful insight or answers for the firm. Unfortunately, I don't know that we all provide you a good process for doing that. So today is my attempt at sharing with you a process that I actually use in industry. My background is in management strategy consulting, and so we're going to look at this 8-step linear process to actually help you develop meaningful, substantive solutions for the particular firms that you're going to be looking at. So our learning objectives for today are simple. One is to describe the 8 essential steps for analyzing any firm, whether it's something that you're doing in your capstone or any other class that you may be in. It could be a case or it could be a live client that you're working with. 2, to identify the essential components of each step in the analytic process. So we'll break this down. I'll provide for you, at least from my perspective as an instructor, what I'm looking for students to be able to provide for each one of these. And third and lastly, to understand the importance of sequence or the linearity of this. What you'll find very quickly is, these steps will build upon the step that came before it. So to skip a step or to skip multiple steps and think we'll come back to it, we're in danger of making some assumptions that may not prove out to be that accurate. All right, so let's kind of get into the process. Here's the overview of the process. So we begin with a firm overview, and then we look at the business challenge itself, talk a little bit about why I use the term business challenge instead of problem. We'll talk about environmental analyses, then identifying options. From options, we derive our strategic recommendation, our ultimate option, that, so to speak, that we want to offer the firm. Our implementation plan, because having an idea of what to do but not a way to do it doesn't really help the firm. Pro forma, because every business decision at some point becomes an economic decision. And then risk assessment. The truth is, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. And so our goal as strategists or business analysts is to identify the things that are likely to go wrong and make sure the firm can stay ahead of them. Here's step 1 in our analytic process, the firm overview. And the goal of the firm overview is actually help us gain an understanding of the company itself. It's hard to help a company if we don't actually have an appreciation for how they do business. And one of the places we start with is in terms of their history. And in terms of history, I don't need to go back 200 years if it's a 200-year-old company, but I probably want to know what's going on within the last 10 or 20 years, particularly that history that's relevant to whatever the business challenge is that I'm focusing on. So that's why I say relevant, not necessarily ancient. We want to look at the current strategy. How is the firm currently going about achieving their goals? And it's not just about identifying it, but it's actually assessing it. So I need you to take a critical look at this and ask the question, is this an effective strategy? Is it a complete strategy? Is there something lacking? Has it become obsolete over time necessarily? We want to know who the players are, right? Obviously, the CEO is someone very important. But if this is a problem or a challenge within a particular product group, who's that group manager? Stakeholders, though, are not just employees. They could be customers, they could be shareholders, they could be regulatory agencies. Really what we're looking for here in terms of identifying stakeholders are those people who exert influence. And the influence we're looking at is what's the level of influence that they exert in terms of, 1, the company actually adopting our strategic recommendation, and 2, actually being able to implement it. A couple other considerations here are culture, which looks at how things are done in a particular firm, and values, what is right and wrong. And I'll tell you from experience as a consultant, culture and values are landmines that I step on all the time whenever I fail to consider, what is important to this firm, what do they value, and again, what things are right and wrong, what's right and wrong behavior. Is it good behavior to be in a meeting that's really passionate and loud, or do they tend to do things more peacefully? So now we turn to the business challenge, right? And I begin this with a quote. The client rarely, if ever, gets it right. As a consultant, having done this for 15 plus years now outside the firm and another dozen years before that inside firms, I will tell you that the problem people come to you with is rarely the problem. If they knew what the problem actually was, they wouldn't need to hire you or assign this to you as a task. Most often, people are going on their guts or experience or intuition, but they're really not getting to the root of what's going on. So a few things to consider when we're trying to identify the business challenge. First is, we need to distinguish between a problem or an opportunity. And that's why I use the term business challenge and not business problem. Because sometimes what's concerning to the CEO is there's a great opportunity out there. How do I take advantage of it, right? Maybe customer tastes are changing. We see in technology, people want to go to wearable technology. Well, if I'm Apple, that's clearly an opportunity, right? And so how do I exploit that? Can I exploit it? So again, it's not always a bad thing. We need to distinguish between symptom and problem. You've heard that it said before, you can go to your doctor for a headache and he can prescribe you aspirin, which is great, unless the cause, isn't necessarily stress of your headache, but it's a brain tumor, then the aspirin isn't the right solution. So we need to dig deeper. We need to see if something could be causing this. And I always ask that question when students bring to me their business challenge is there something that could be causing that business challenge? Because if there is, then that may be, the underlying business challenge that I have to deal with, all right? Root cause analysis is an excellent tool. There are many different ways to do that to help us dig deeper into really what's going on with the firm. And the last thing we need to do in identifying the business challenge is we have to be able to impact it. And in impacting the challenge, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make the case to management that this is something you should be focused on, right? And so we want to make sure that we can communicate it in some measurable terms. What is the economic harm that the firm is going to experience if management chooses to ignore this challenge that I've identified? Or how much money are we leaving on the table if we fail to pick up this opportunity that may be available to us? All right. Again, down here at the bottom, you'll see what happens if management ignores that challenge. Remember, one of the things you're always about is selling your ideas. So you're trying to convince management here that this is something they should be paying attention to. So now we know the business challenge. That gives us a sense of where we need to start looking for insight, information, and ultimately answers, right? So these are what we call environmental analyses. There's an internal analysis where we look inside the firm. Some of the things we might look at are core competencies, the things the firm does well, or their current strategies. We may look at their competitive advantage, and we may look structurally at them, their value chains, activity maps, or just a couple of the tools that we can use. And of course, we don't ever want to ignore financial capacity. And so we always want to do an upfront financial analysis for the firm because we want to know that whatever solution we come up with, the firm actually has the financial wherewithal to actually execute that strategy. You may come up with a silver bullet solution that costs the firm $1 billion, but if all they have is $1 million in the bank, it may be tough for them. And we look at strengths and weaknesses. So if you remember SWOT analysis, that's looking inside the firm. What does the firm do particularly well? And what are the things that the firm struggles with? All right, so first we looked inside the house. That was our internal environmental analysis. And now we need to look outside the house, external analysis. Because we know a firm does not exist in a vacuum, right? They're interacting with competitors, they're interacting with customers, interacting with regulatory agencies, lots of interaction that goes on. So in external analysis, again, we're looking outside the firm. We may look at the macro environment, and a tool that we oftentimes use to do that is a STEEP or pest analysis. We look at the industry. A typical analysis for that would be a Porter's Five Forces. We want to look at competition and how we're interacting with them and how we're performing compared to them. Customer needs, right? Doesn't matter how great the product is that you have. If the customer doesn't actually need it, then it'll just sit on the shelf. We want to assess our market. And lastly, we want to consider opportunities and threats. If you remember back on our SWOT, remember, strengths and weaknesses look inside the house, and opportunities and threats look outside the house at the external environment. Now, hopefully, as you've been doing this environmental analysis, looking inside and out, you've been gaining key insights, right? So it's not just enough to actually generate data, right, which all of your analytic frameworks will help you do, but you actually want to know what's relevant about that data. What insight can I gain from that data? Basically, we need to interpret it. I always tell my students, I can hire monkeys to generate data. I need analysts to actually tell me what's significant about that. And so then once I have this data, right, this insight, from these analyses, I can move on to the next step in our process, which is actually identifying options. So we know a little bit about the company, we understand the challenges before them, and we have a great deal of insight about how they operate and how the environment outside them is operating and interacting with them. So in terms of identifying options, this shouldn't be singular option. Actually, we should come up with many options. And this is the fun part, right? This is where we actually get to sit down and brainstorm and come up with cool solutions. So first of all, we should generate, again, many options. There is no single silver bullet solution to any business challenge out there. So you want to come up with as many options as possible. One of the tests of them, though, is that they must solve at least some of the challenge. Either they exploit the opportunity or they mitigate some of the problem that's been created. And they have to be practical or implementable. You can't come up with a solution, that we don't have technology that's actually going to be able to support that. You may braille the technological environment and realize that research and development is taking us in that direction, but if we're not there yet, I don't know if I would want to suggest that to the company, only to find out that technology is going to be 5 or 10 years out. It must flow from the environmental analyses. So anything that you come up with as an option, I should see in your environmental analyses, right? I should see an industry, an external environment that supports that particular strategy that you're going to be presenting to me, and I should be able to look inside the firm to say, okay, they've got the capabilities to do this, and they're not rife with weaknesses that would prevent them from accomplishing that. It must be measurable, and most importantly, it should be financially measurable. At some point, all business decisions, again, are economic decisions. So I should be able to measure in some way, what is the benefit of pursuing any particular option. And the nice thing about that, if I do it properly, is now I have the ability to compare options. So you may come up with 8 options. Now I can do an apples-to-apples comparison, at least along the economics of it, to see which one is going to get me a better return or which one's going to cost me more money. It has to be something that's sustainable, something that, we don't want to spend a year to develop this particular option only to be able to benefit from it for 2 or 3 months. So we want to create something that's longer lasting. And note, and I said this earlier, there are no silver bullets. Don't feel like you have to develop an option that's going to solve 100% of the company's challenge or fully exploit the opportunity that's out there. I've been doing this for 25 plus years, and I'm still yet to find a perfect solution. We only strive to solve as much of the challenge as we can, and hopefully that's good enough for the firm. So we developed all these great options, which is wonderful. Now we actually have to kind of narrow them down because it's just not practical for a firm to pursue all options. And to be quite honest, there's probably some redundancy from option to option. So now we have to go about actually creating a recommendation. Now the recommendation is really nothing more than, what's the optimal mix of options in terms of, 1, efficacy, how much of the challenge does it solve? And 2, feasibility. Does it efficiently employ the assets to maximize returns? Do we have the capability to actually do this? Now, remember I said, there's a linearity to this here in terms of this process. I don't ever have to worry about coming up with unreasonable options or an unreasonable strategic recommendation for the firm if I have done the earlier steps about understanding the firm, in our overview or looking at the environment itself, right? If I understand that, if I understand what its strengths, its opportunities, its weaknesses, its threats are, I'm very unlikely to present an option or a recommendation that they'll be incapable of actually implementing. All right. And just a note in terms of this optimal mix. You may come up with, say, 10 options, but it may only be reasonable to implement 2 or 3 of those options. And that's okay. It's all right to leave options off your final recommendation. We always like to share them in our reports because management may want to take a look at them and consider them at a future date. but your job is what are the best options for them at this time. We want to make sure that our strategic recommendation aligns with and augments or replaces the current strategy. So remember, we did that strategic analysis up front, the company's current strategy. We don't want to do something that's completely contrary to that strategy unless we realize that it's completely fractured and it needs to be done away with and replaced with a new strategy. If it's just to supplement that strategy, we want to make sure it's consistent with it. And again, this goes back to our stakeholder analysis. We want to make sure that recommendation is something that's going to be endorsed and supported by key stakeholders. Are they going to be able to get behind this and support it, or are we going to have some challenges? And just a note here, just because we have challenges is not necessarily the death knell of our recommendation, but it may be a consideration as to how we actually implement it in terms of bringing people alongside us. So here we formulated our recommendation based on the options that we've developed. Now we actually have to develop an implementation plan, right? No one wants to hear just, here's the way to solve your problem, or here is a solution to your problem. They want a roadmap. They want to paint by numbers. How do I actually implement this? So, what are a couple things that we need to consider when we're developing our implementation plan? Well, one, we want detailed activities. If I need to, build a manufacturing plant in Singapore, I need to note that. If I need to hire people, I need to note that. If I need to develop new business or new sales channels, I need to note that. What are the specific activities that we have to engage in? What is the timeline? How long is it going to take? And I say here, clearly define the critical path. We probably can't start all activities at the same time, right? Sometimes, we need to get particular permits, let's say if we want to go into another country, before we can actually find a place to build our factory, right? So we want to note on the timeline here, what's the order of events? And then we need to consider resource allocation, and it's particularly dollars and hours. How much is it going to cost me in terms of money and in terms of man hours? Every activity has costs in those two dimensions there. Management needs to be able to budget for that and make sure that those resources are available at the right time. And so that's why we kind of lay it out here across this timeline. All right, so the last thing in terms of the implementation plan we want to consider are implementation-related challenges or risks. And really what we want to look at here are what are the things that are likely to go wrong with implementing this plan, whether it's building a plant or launching a new product. We're not looking for the 1 in a million things. We're looking at those things that are likely to happen and those things that are of significance in terms of their impact on our plan. And lastly, we want to define what success looks like, right? So if we've implemented this correctly, if it's the right recommendation, right, and we've done well by it, what are metrics? Are we going to measure it in terms of sales? Are we going to measure it in terms of market presence? Are we going to measure in terms of customer acceptance? What are we going to look at here? How are we going to know that we've actually succeeded? So this is our plan. So now we need to start making the business case, at least economically speaking. And we do that with our pro forma. And what are some important elements to having a pro forma? Well, first of all costs. Again, no plan is without costs. And so our job is to estimate those costs as best we can. Building a factory has a cost associated with it, but don't forget the fact that you're going to be running that factory and there's going to be some ongoing operational costs associated with that as you're building out your pro forma. We want to look at all revenues, and we want to make good estimates about what those revenues are going to be. I'm always impressed by students who will give me their business plan and will tell me that, when we launch this new product, we're going to get $100 million in sales in the first year. They fail to recognize, though, that it's going to take 9 months of that first year to actually build a plant to produce that product. We want to calculate what the return may be, and you can use any number of different ratios to do that. You can use net present value, return on investment, you can use economic value add. There are lots of tools out there. But in some way, we want to demonstrate to management that this investment will return some sort of profit to them. We want to know what the capital at risk is. What's the ultimately, what could they potentially lose associated with your recommendation? When is break-even going to occur? again, it's unlikely that they're going to hit break even in the first year. It may be 2, 3, 4, 5 years or even more until they actually break even on this investment. And my encouragement here is to be realistic. If it's going to take 7 or 8 years to reach break even, be honest about it. Don't try and candy coat that. Your job is to be honest with management, and they'll determine whether or not they can live with that. Lastly, just a comment, a pro forma is nothing more than a group of assumptions. Our goal is that these assumptions be reasoned and well supported, right? So we want to make guesses, but we want them to be the best informed guesses that we can provide. So lastly, once we have the pro forma, we need to do a basic risk assessment. And again, kind of back to our implementation plan risk, we want to know what are the likely risks. We're not looking necessarily for black swans. We're not concerned about a meteorite crashing into Earth or the next ice age. We want to know what the impacts of those risks are. If those risks were to be realized, what could it cost the firm? And lastly, how best might we prevent these risks? It's easy to say what could go wrong. What's really valuable is being able to offer to management, these are the things that we should do to help mitigate or reduce the likelihood or the impact of that risk upon us. And so these are the 8 steps in terms of analyzing a firm. You'll see here that there's a very important progression here that we need to follow. Ultimately, if we can provide this to management, we've built a great business case for them. All right, so this is the end of our 8-step process. I hope that you appreciate the linearity of it, the importance to follow these steps in this particular sequence, noting that one does build upon the other. So, to summarize where we've been, first, we described the 8 essential steps for analyzing a firm. We identified essential components of each step in that analytic process. And lastly, to understand the importance of sequence, or the reason why these steps are in the order in which they are, in that they build off one another. I hope this has been helpful and a tool that you'll be able to use going forward in your time here at the Fox School of Business.